I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we can believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico, and I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
And I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. This week, we're talking with Matt Eisenbrandt, the author of a book, Assassination of a Saint, The Plot to Murder Oscar Romero and the Quest to Bring His Killers to Justice. Matt is a human rights lawyer at the Center for Justice and Accountability who worked on a really wild case involving a man who was connected to the murder of Oscar Romero.
Matt has a ton to say, but if you can believe it, there's even more in his book, and you should definitely check it out. There's also a companion website that goes along with the book, in case you don't want the book, but I don't know why that would be the case, called assassinationofasaint.com, and the website has a bunch of declassified government documents on it and videos of Matt talking, and it's very cool, so let's just get right into it.
Thanks for coming on the show, Matt. We're really excited to have you. The book is so fascinating. When we interview an author, we always ask them to start out giving a little introduction to both themselves, so who are you, and an elevator pitch for your book so that everybody's kind of on the same page. So could you just tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are, why you're interested in Romero, and what is Assassination of a Saint all about?
Sure. So I'm a U.S. trained lawyer, and my Assassination of a Saint came out of the work that I've been lucky enough to do over my career, which is basically a focus on human rights law and bringing legal cases that try to help people who are survivors or victims of human rights abuses and trying to hold accountable those who are responsible, whether those are governments or individuals or corporations. And that's been the focus of my career. I currently work for a law firm in Vancouver, Canada, and with a specific focus on cases against Canadian mining companies that are alleged to be involved in human rights abuses in their operations overseas. So that's kind of the thread that runs through it. And Assassination of a Saint grew out of one of the cases that I was lucky enough to work on very early in my career, back in 2003 and 2004, because one of the people very linked to the assassination of Oscar Romero was actually found to be living in California, not too far away from the offices where I worked at the Center for Justice and Accountability in San Francisco. And as a result of him being in California, we launched an investigation that eventually led to a legal case. And so Assassination of a Saint is the story of that investigation and that case, but also in trying to tell that story, I also wanted to make sure that I got into answering the question of why someone like Oscar Romero, who is now a saint, could have been murdered. And so, what I tried to do with the book was talk about the how and by whom, but also about the why. And that was my goal in writing Assassination of a Saint.
Cool. So Oscar Romero is a massive figure, in not just the Catholic Church, but also among activists and justice organizations around the world. Why do you think his life and story resonate so deeply with so many people?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One certainly is that he is one of those rare people who died for what he believed in. He knew that he was going to be killed, and he didn't alter what he was doing. And that, in the Catholic Church, obviously being a martyr has very specific meaning and importance. But I think even outside of the Catholic world, he was still considered a martyr in sort of non-religious ways that people might think of. And he is somebody who faced down the death squads, faced down the military in El Salvador, and continued to speak the truth, even though he knew that was going to likely lead to his death. I think that resonates with a lot of people. But there's also, because of the religious element, with El Salvador at that time being such an overwhelmingly Catholic country with such a strong Catholic history, and for somebody to basically break with the old traditions where the Catholic Church was considered to be very conservative and very aligned with those in power, and for Romero to align himself somewhat surprisingly with the poor and the oppressed in El Salvador, I think also is a reason that he and his message and then his death resonates so much with people, is the way that he took what was going on in El Salvador and spoke out about it in incredibly brave ways, but always did it through what he believed to be the teachings of the Catholic Church. And so I think for certainly for Catholics, but for people of any faith, I think that has a lot of power, and I think that his courage in doing that is what made him so famous, and his assassination front page news around the world.
Yeah, I think that at least resonates with how I've seen Romero get talked about both in the Catholic Church and elsewhere. And maybe you could kind of continue to set the stage a little bit more, too, talking about the environment that Romero finds himself in. So he becomes the Archbishop of San Salvador in a political environment that's controlled by the far right and also challenged by a pretty extreme far left. And then there's lots and lots of average people, poor people, etc. in between. So could you kind of explain a little bit more of those moving parts? What's the political world that Romero is a part of? You're alluding to kind of the surprise that people had when he didn't turn out to be the conservative bishop that many people maybe had thought that he would be. So could you just describe that scene? What are the kind of political moving parts around him?
Yeah, it was a very complex situation in El Salvador, but in some ways, the dynamics that led to his assassination 3 years after being named archbishop are pretty clear. So El Salvador was a country with decades of military governments and the repression that came with that. And so that was pretty much the status quo in El Salvador in 1977 when Romero became archbishop. The country was basically going through yet another fraudulent election that was essentially just passing power from one military dictator to another. And the military had for some decades not faced much resistance because of tremendous bloodshed back many, many years ago that tamped down resistance. But by 1977, there were virtually every sector of society was rising up. The overwhelming majority in nonviolent ways, calling on reforms in every sector of society. but because that was so frequently met with violence by the governing military, eventually over time, more and more people joined the armed resistance that in 1977 was actually quite small, but there was an armed resistance, and they were carrying out audacious kidnappings of wealthy people, sometimes murders of wealthy people, sometimes bombings. So there was sort of that kind of guerrilla warfare going on by a small number of people, but it was enough to make those in power, and those both with economic power and with governing military power, really caused them to ramp up the repression rather than enacting reforms that could have changed society for the better. And so that was the situation that Romero confronted when he became Archbishop of San Salvador. And he, as you said, there were a lot of people who thought that he was going to be rather conservative. His history up to that point, did not make him some sort of, outspoken arch-conservative, but I think he was seen as someone who probably wasn't going to rock the boat very much. In El Salvador at that time, the Catholic Church was so powerful that the Vatican's the papal nuncio, the Vatican's ambassador to El Salvador, actually would meet with members of the military government and members of the economic elites, what were called the oligarchs, and would actually meet with them and talk to them about who should be chosen as archbishop. And they were overwhelmingly in favor of Romero being archbishop instead of another person who was more supported by the priests who were at the grassroots level and interacting with the broader population of El Salvador. So Romero was seen as kind of a safe choice for the military government and for the oligarchs. And so it came as quite a surprise, I think, to many of them when just weeks into his time as archbishop, Romero became quite outspoken about the military repression. And that then I think he would have been targeted regardless, but I think this sense of betrayal probably increased the anger against him because those who helped to put him in as archbishop didn't think that he would turn on them the way that he did.
Dang, the politics of El Salvador are pretty interesting to say the least. But Oscar Romero himself had some pretty interesting political opinions. So just like you said, he wasn't really a Marxist, even though people, called him one. Could you tell us a little bit about his politics and maybe how anti-communism came to play in him being vilified and ultimately killed?
Yeah. So in fact, I taking the guidance from those who knew him, I actually try to avoid using the word politics when talking about Romero. I actually quote one of the Jesuit priests in the book when we asked him that very question at the trial, and his answer was that Romero was not a political person. He was he believed following the dictates of the Catholic Church, and that started with the Vatican II in the 1960s, and the major changes that were enacted in the Catholic Church worldwide, but then in particular in the Latin American Bishops' Conference in 1968 in Medellin, Colombia, where the Church at the highest levels was dedicating itself to the poor, and that was something that Romero took very seriously. He actually didn't take it to the extremes that others did. Some who were linked to liberation theology, which is we'll definitely talk about. There were some priests who even went so far as joining armed rebellions in Central America, but that was not Romero. Romero believed very strongly that the theology of the Catholic Church at that time required him to commit himself to the poor and to speak out against repression. And I don't think that he saw himself as being political at all. He saw himself as doing his job as Archbishop in following the teachings of the Catholic Church. And so I think that it was really others who attributed what he did and what he said to politics. So certainly he was condemned, and it may seem hard for people to believe, nowadays, and if you're talking in a North American context, but he and other priests were denounced very clearly as Marxists, as communists, as traitors, as terrorists, and this was not. This was not a random stray Twitter comment, right? These were in the biggest newspapers in El Salvador, and it's so Romero and other priests who felt that they were doing what they were required to do based on Catholic teachings. They were then branded with political labels that not only didn't fit them in terms of where they might even fall on a political spectrum, but the fact is that they weren't necessarily trying to be political per se. Certainly, Romero was aware of the politics around him, and I think very aware of what were the consequences of his actions. But he adhered always very closely to the line that yes, there did need to be economic liberation. In other words, there needed to be a focus on the poor and improving their lives, and a redistribution of wealth. But he was not looking at it from a Marxist angle, because he was always very clear that there had to be a spiritual liberation, a spiritual component to that simply didn't exist in atheistic Marxism. And so he wrote about Marxism, and he analyzed it, and in his earlier days was harshly critical of Marxism, and in later years I think had a more nuanced view, but always rejected the atheism of Marxism, even if some of his beliefs or some of his teachings might align with some economic aspects of Marxism. Nonetheless, everybody in El Salvador at that time who was calling for reforms, even quite moderate reforms, was branded with that label of communist or Marxist, and that then made them what people believed were then legitimate targets for extermination in that sort of repressive environment.
Cool. Well, that helps definitely give us a little bit of a wider understanding of Romero and maybe why he is not as political as some people think. But could you broadly describe just the assassination of Saint Romero and help us get a grasp on what happened there, who assassinated him and why?
Yeah, the assassination is one of those things that there's still a lot of mystery around it in terms of who actually pulled the trigger and who might have given the original order for him to be killed. But in fact, those who killed him, who carried it out, and the general group that was responsible for are actually very well known and have been for quite a while. So Romero was killed by a death squad that was headed by a man named Roberto D'Aubuisson, and we'll, I'm sure, talk more about him. But D'Aubuisson was an extreme anti-communist and was and became sort of the face of anti-communism in El Salvador. And while he was a public figure and eventually a politician, in 1980, he was also running this death squad and running clandestine operations. And it was a group of his people, his chief of security, and a few other people who were very close to him, who decided to carry out the assassination on March 24th, 1980. And what was unique about Romero's assassination in El Salvador at that time was that it was carried out by a single marksman with a single rifle shot. Most death squad operations in El Salvador at that time were carried out by a group of people with automatic weapons who would, burst into someone's house and shoot up the place and usually kill multiple people and then leave. Romero's assassination was different because there was, one car sent to the church where Romero was saying mass, and there was one driver, and the shooter was sitting in the back seat, and they just pulled up in front of the church, and with a single gunshot, Romero was killed, and then the car was able to drive away and eventually reconnected with the chief of security and eventually later down the road with D'Aubuisson. And so it was a unique sort of assassination in El Salvador at that time, but it was also all the more appalling because Romero was shot while he was saying mass in the Divina Providencia Chapel, which was on the grounds of a cancer hospital where Romero chose to live. And so it was the assassination itself was appalling because of that, but then also because if you could kill the most important Catholic figure in a very Catholic country, it sent the signal that anybody could be killed. And there is no doubt that was a message that they were trying to send to terrorize the country and terrorize those who might want to speak out. So they silenced Romero, who was probably the most important voice in the country, while at the same time then terrorizing others and trying to silence others. And the fact is that what it did was it ended up leading to a full-on civil war, basically at the beginning of the next year. Romero was one of the few people who might have been able to hold together the different extremes of the country. And by eliminating him, they were eliminating one of the most important voices or one of the most important bridges in the country, and therefore making it much more likely that the country would end up in a full-on civil war, and that's what happened.
Yeah, thanks for laying all that out. I mean, it is such a haunting image, and you describe it quite a bit in your book, just the events leading up to it. Another thing that kind of makes your book just really compelling is the way that you're able to dramatize both Romero's life and the challenges around prosecuting people who are involved in Romero's death. So, as you were telling the story just now, it's like there's one driver, one shooter, there's a sort of loose timeline of events, but putting that all together was quite difficult. So why was it difficult to bring his killers to justice in particular, and why was your legal team involved? You were saying you work as a human rights lawyer. Why exactly would you take on a case like this, and how did that pan out?
The context for the case that we were involved in the U.S. You have to first look at what was going on in El Salvador, and that's part of why it made it important for this case to happen in the United States. So in El Salvador, at the end of the Civil War in 1992, there was eventually a truth commission, a United Nations Truth Commission that was created, and was actually quite detailed about a number of the key human rights violations that happened during the course of the war. And one of their most important cases was Romero's assassination. And the Truth Commission named names of those who were responsible. But then 5 days after the Truth Commission report came out in 1993, the Salvadoran legislature, which was then controlled by the political party that was founded by Roberto D'Aubuisson, the mastermind of the Romero assassination, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the legislature passed an amnesty law, a sweeping amnesty law that basically prevented the chance of any prosecution for any of the grave crimes that happened during the Civil War, but in particular for Romero's assassination. One of the people who was involved, who was D'Aubuisson's chief of security, was named Alvaro Saravia. And Saravia had, during the 80s, actually had a case opened against him in El Salvador, although it didn't end up going anywhere. And if there's time, maybe I'll tell that story. But so Saravia, because of the amnesty law, had his case closed in El Salvador. No one else was ever attempted to be prosecuted, and from 1993 forward, there was basically no possibility of bringing a case because the amnesty law would have prevented it. So when in 2001 it became known that Alvaro Saravia was actually living in the United States, and one of the stories that I tell in the book, which is just kind of an amazing coincidence, is that somebody, a Salvadoran man who was working with the Center for Justice and Accountability, the nonprofit organization where I would start working soon thereafter, he was in a lawyer's office in San Francisco, and in that same law office, he saw Alvaro Saravia. And he knew that Saravia was linked to the Romero assassination. So it was quite a crazy coincidence. And then several months later, the Miami Herald ran a story naming Saravia as being in the United States and said that he was actually in Modesto, California. So it was his presence in California that was the reason that CJA started investigating the case, and the reason that CJA did that was because the mandate of the organization was to hold war criminals and other human rights abusers accountable in U.S. courts. And with that mandate, and with the fact that there was complete impunity in El Salvador, and Romero's assassination was never going to be prosecuted or go to trial in El Salvador, there was a strong belief at CJA and then amongst people in the Salvadoran community who knew about it that the case was really important to bring in the United States. And so that was what launched the investigation that eventually led to the case against Saravia. So prosecuting these cases is extremely difficult when you're confronted with, one, an amnesty law in the country where it happened, so nothing's going to happen there. Secondly, with the passage of time, so by the time the case actually got filed in the United States, it had been 24 years since Romero's assassination. So memories have faded, evidence has been lost. But then on top of that, you have an incredible fear and great danger for people in El Salvador who might know something about the assassination to speak about it. And so even though it was 23, 24 years later, even though there was a civilian government in place at that point in El Salvador, many people were still terrified, to speak about the Romero assassination or any of the other human rights abuses, including the many massacres that happened in El Salvador during the war. So all of those elements, plus the fact that usually there are not people involved who are willing to speak about it, and in fact, there often are public not only denials but misinformation about who was responsible for these atrocities. And so all of those different factors make investigating and prosecuting these cases extremely difficult. And we ran into a lot of those difficulties, but having access to the U.S. court system at least made it somewhat easier than, say, it would have been to, for a Salvadoran prosecutor to try and bring the case there. So it's very, very complex to try to put together these cases, and it's an uphill battle from the beginning.
Yeah, this is so wild. What a absolutely just crazy story. I'm like just astounded sitting here. I haven't looked at the book too, so I'm double astounded. So trials are kind of a weird thing, especially in this situation. So we got this guy, Saravia, and he is, involved and guilty. So maybe you could tell us, maybe you could tell us on the one hand, like just like what happened in the trial and, what the verdict of the trial was. But then maybe you could give us like a larger kind of understanding of, what this means, or who else might be culpable for Romero's death, or like, what else is going on here.
Yeah, so I'll try and explain the trial because it was quite unique. So most people think of a trial where the defendant is sitting there and he has a lawyer, and then there's either prosecutors or plaintiffs' lawyers on the other side, and all the things that we're used to on TV or in the news. The difference in our case was that there was no defendant there and there was no defense lawyer there. And I'll maybe explain it really quickly without hopefully getting into too many boring legal details. But the case that we brought in the United States was actually a civil lawsuit. So it was not a criminal prosecution where Saravia was arrested and sent to jail. Instead, it was a civil lawsuit that basically sought a judgment and then money damages, essentially compensation for Romero's assassination. And the reason that it was a civil lawsuit is because at the time in the United States, you couldn't actually bring a criminal prosecution for this type of a case. It was a murder that happened in El Salvador and was committed by Salvadorans against a Salvadoran. And so the presence of Alvaro Saravia in the United States was by itself not enough for there to be a criminal case. And even if there had been proper laws for that, that still would have depended on government prosecutors in the United States being willing to do that. So what was available to us was a civil lawsuit under some rather interesting laws that I won't get into right now, but that was the avenue that we were able to pursue. And so our client was a relative of Oscar Romero, and it was in that person's name that we were bringing the case. And so the trial, what happened was that, and I tell the story in the book of trying to locate Saravia, and the fact that we were sure we knew where he was, we knew what address he was living at, we had plenty of evidence on that, but we never actually saw him in person before we started the case. But because of all these connections to an address in Modesto, California, the court said that we could continue with the case even though we hadn't actually seen him. We always anticipated that he would eventually come forward and at least try and defend some aspect of the case. But in fact, he never actually did. I hope some of the more interesting parts of the book were the investigation that we did and the information that we uncovered about where he actually was. But nonetheless, we were able to take the case to trial, even though he wasn't there, because it was a civil lawsuit. If it had been a criminal case, the U.S. Constitution would have prohibited the trial from happening in his absence. But because it was a civil lawsuit, we were able to take it to trial. And the judge actually gave us several days in court to be able to present our evidence. And I think that was, he didn't have to do that. And it was quite significant that he did, because I think he understood the historical importance of doing this. I think he understood what an important figure Romero was, and he understood that no one had ever been put on trial for this very famous, very impactful murder that happened in El Salvador. And so the trial ended up going forward, even in the absence of Saravia, and we were able to put on, somewhat strong evidence about the assassination itself, a lot of evidence about Romero and who he was and what his impact was and what the impact of his assassination was. But we also, through our investigation, were able to speak with the judge in El Salvador who had been assigned the day of the assassination to go and investigate the murder, and who only a few days later had to flee El Salvador because there was an assassination attempt against him. So he testified at our trial, as did a number of other people who were very close to Romero, and through the biggest surprise of our investigation, we actually located the getaway driver from the assassination, and he came to court and testified about what happened the day of the murder. So that was the trial that we were able to put on, and at the end of it, the judge found that Saravia was legally responsible for Romero's murder, found that Roberto Dabison was the mastermind of the assassination, and entered a verdict in our favor. And like I said, it was a civil lawsuit, and so he attached a dollar figure to it of $10 million. So that was the trial. But as you mentioned in your question, there are several other people who were responsible for the assassination. Roberto Dabison by that time had died. He died in 1992, so he was no longer alive. There was at least one other very well-known person, very connected to the assassination, who had also died. There is one person in particular who, while he has always denied having any role in Romero's assassination, the evidence says otherwise, and he is alive and living freely in El Salvador. There are a handful of other people who could very easily be investigated in El Salvador and have links to the assassination. What we were hoping to do with our case, and what we tried to do with our case, was to essentially go up the chain of command. So we knew that Roberto D'Aubuson's death squad that carried out Romero's assassination did not exist in a vacuum. His death squad was supported and financed by wealthy oligarchs in El Salvador. And there was evidence about the support that his death squad got. Because of that, because of the social situation in El Salvador and the fact that these wealthy elites, these oligarchs, essentially ran the country in conjunction with the military, and because many of them supported death squad activities, we hoped through our case to be able to bring in as defendants those who might have financed Romero's assassination. And that was a big focus of our investigation for over a year. And I talk about it at length in the book in terms of some of the evidence that we were able to gather, but also, as we discussed before, the difficulty of prosecuting these cases and bringing investigation in carrying out, complete investigations. And at the end of the day, despite the evidence that existed and some new evidence that we found, we weren't able to put together enough evidence to bring anyone else into the case, including powerful people who might have financed the assassination. So there are still there is still a need for a widespread and serious investigation in El Salvador, not just into those who were there planning it that day, not just into who pulled the trigger, but into who were the people higher up who had given the order or supported or funded the death squad that carried out the assassination. That's where a serious investigation is needed, but a serious investigation hasn't been done by prosecutors, and it remains to be done if we're ever going to truly get to the bottom of the Romero assassination and break the impunity that's existed for so long in El Salvador.
Thanks so much for putting that out. I mean, one of the most compelling things about the book is not just the story about Romero that you tell, but exactly that story of all these investigations. I mean, you guys really clearly did your homework, and that comes through. Something else that comes through in your book is the wide role of political connections surrounding Romero's death, not just in El Salvador, but also in the United States. And as people who think about the left and that sort of thing on this podcast a lot, we're pretty invested in that conversation. So could you say something a little bit about maybe not just the culpability of individuals in El Salvador, but also the role of, U.S. Foreign policy and imperialist sort of ties that might have been responsible some way or another for Romero's death?
Yeah, that's really important context here, and maybe I'll go back a little bit into history because there's also it's really important to talk about the U.S. role both for the culpability of the United States, but also I think to clarify sometimes some of the misperceptions about what role the U.S. did or didn't play. In the book, I kind of choose the starting point as John F. Kennedy's administration, I think you can go even farther back than that. But certainly Kennedy came in at a time right after the Cuban Revolution, and it can't be overstated the impact of what happened in Cuba on the United States that had always seen Latin America as its backyard. And that's something that the Monroe Doctrine was about and continued, throughout the 20th century. And in the Cold War context, Kennedy and later Johnson and other administrations after saw anti-communism as an absolutely essential and central part of foreign policy, particularly, I mean, obviously in other countries, Vietnam and many other countries, but very definitely in Latin America. U.S. governments did not want, another Cuban revolution to happen anywhere else in Latin America. And, there are plenty of examples in other countries of democratically elected people in Guatemala, in Chile, whose governments were overthrown with U.S. government assistance. But the Kennedy's administration in going forward actually trained militaries throughout Latin America, including El Salvador's, in counterinsurgency techniques, in counterintelligence techniques, basically, how to confront guerrilla armies, leftist guerrilla armies, and how to hold them at bay. And so it was that sort of doctrine, what was later called the National Security Doctrine, was what led to the development of military policies in Latin America, and then eventually to paramilitary organizations that basically became death squads. And so in El Salvador, the death squad apparatus was there throughout developed in the 1960s into the 1970s, and that apparatus was then accessed by death squads. And so the death squad that killed Oscar Romero, I have never seen any evidence that the U.S. government had any direct role in Romero's assassination or in that death squad's activities in particular. But it's that context of anti-communism and military training that is important in what resulted in the death squads in El Salvador. The other, maybe I'll come back to sort of going forward. But another important link with the United States is that so while Roberto D'Aubuisson was running his death squad, but also was a vocal and public anti-communist crusader, he was making links. He had the support of and continued to make links with economic elites in El Salvador, and they in turn began making connections with political figures in the United States, generally on the far right of the Republican Party. Senator Jesse Helms is one of the key examples of that. Many of the oligarchs in El Salvador had already had strong connections with the United States. Many of them went to school in the United States. Many spoke perfect English, had second homes, in Miami or elsewhere. So there were already strong connections with the United States on that level. And then in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, D'Aubuisson and his supporters began holding meetings and strengthening ties with political figures in Washington. So all of that is important in understanding the U.S. role. What I will say is there are many people who remember Romero's assassination as taking place during the Reagan administration, and when I've given talks about the book, I've had people ask questions that are essentially saying, well, isn't it true that Reagan killed Romero? And I have to remind people that in fact Reagan wasn't president when Romero was assassinated. It was Jimmy Carter, and Carter's foreign policy. Again, these things are so complex, but Carter's foreign policy was both supportive of Romero, but also supportive of those who were against Romero. So, Jimmy Carter's foreign policy famously incorporated human rights for the first time. But his human rights, that element of foreign policy, while important and to be applauded, was also, left to the side many times because, again, Jimmy Carter's administration didn't want to see Cuban revolutions in lots of other Latin American countries. And in fact, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua took over in 1979. And at that point, the United States wanted to make sure that absolutely that El Salvador didn't also fall. And so, Carter sent an ambassador to El Salvador in early 1980, Robert White, who was in charge of fortifying the center. In other words, avoiding a civil war. And Ambassador White saw Oscar Romero as being an absolutely key figure in the center that might be able to hold the country together. And in fact, White was outspoken that the far right was the biggest threat to the country. But at the same time, there was Carter's administration provided aid to the Salvadoran military, and that was aid that Oscar Romero famously denounced in a letter to Jimmy Carter that he then read publicly about a month before he was assassinated. So it was a very complex situation there. And then, obviously once Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter and took over, that was when El Salvador, entered into a full-on civil war with disastrous consequences of military aid from the United States that was far, far beyond anything that had ever been seen before, and helped lead to just widespread atrocities and massacres that happened throughout the 1980s. But whatever the many negative things that we can say about the Reagan administration's role in El Salvador, I just always need to point out that in fact, it was Jimmy Carter who was president when Romero was assassinated, and in a rather complex, situation in terms of the U.S. role and U.S. foreign policy at the time.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful thing to point out. That definitely makes the picture a little bit more complicated, but still pretty interesting. Well, you talk in your book about how the people behind Romero's murder were and continue to be normalized by politicians in the United States. Roberto de Abusin, in particular, was praised by people like Elliot Abrams, who now serves as the U.S. Special Envoy to Venezuela. Really recently, Ilhan Omar challenged Abrams about U.S. policy in El Salvador, and something that he called the the sort of political inheritance of El Salvador a fabulous achievement. But as someone who worked on this case, how do you react to people like Abrams not only being allowed to stay in government, but to be appointed to oversee a fragile situation in a Latin American country like Venezuela?
Well, when you know the history of Central America, and particularly what happened there in the 1980s, it's pretty appalling to see someone like Elliot Abrams kind of constantly recycled, and even though someone with conviction on his record from Iran-Contra, who in my mind has been a part of just disastrous, foreign policy decisions, not only is it kind of appalling to see him continue to pop up again decades later, but just the idea that not that, oh well, we don't have anyone else to go to, so let's go to him, but in fact that the policies that he was a part of and many others were a part of are seen as successful, and I guess when if you see it through the extremely simplistic lens of Cold War, communist versus anti-communist. I guess in that context, if the fact that the FMLN guerrillas never actually took over by military force in El Salvador, well, then I guess that's a success if that's all you were looking for. But the fact that 75,000 civilians were murdered during the Civil War in El Salvador, millions of people fled, and lives in the country were utterly destroyed, in large part through U.S. support for the repressive Salvadoran military that was carrying out massacres. In fact, U.S. government denial of massacres even occurring, or denying that they were the responsibility of the armed forces in El Salvador. All of those things show the tremendous price and just the truly horrifying nature of what U.S. policy was at that time. And so if you're seeing it simply through a lens of, oh, well, we didn't let the insurgents win, then if that's a success, then that's an incredibly oversimplified way of looking at things. And what it does is it lends credence to the idea that that supporting repressive regimes is the way to go. That is, I think that's entirely unacceptable. I will say, just to add to the complexity of the situation, and again, you can say overwhelmingly that U.S. policy in the 1980s in El Salvador was, with the military support was catastrophic. But it is interesting also that there were aspects of the reality where the Reagan administration did take some steps, very belated and not fully effective, but did take some steps in trying to see some cases, including Romero's assassination, prosecuted in El Salvador. Now, there are many reasons for that, and it wasn't, I don't think, out of the goodness of the hearts of high-ranking people in the Reagan administration. A lot of it had to do with pressure from Congress to see that human rights prosecutions were carried out in order to keep the military aid flowing to the Salvadoran military, and I get into that in quite a bit of detail in the book. But it is interesting that while D'Aubuisson was praised by many people on the right in the United States, there was also a great difficulty in supporting him too openly at different points, because that might have led Congress to cut off military aid. So there are, I'm vastly oversimplifying things, and I hope that there's more nuance to it in my book. But even under Reagan, and as appalling as the Reagan policy was in El Salvador, there are some interesting complexities there too, which as I was saying with Carter, I think with Reagan too, there's there are a lot of different factors, particularly when you're looking at what happened in investigating Romero's assassination. So I just thought I would point that out while still strongly denouncing the policy that led to continued support of the Salvadoran military and the deaths of tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's a lot more in the book. You pack a lot in between those two covers, so people who are interested should certainly check that out. But a question to just kind of round the conversation out. So we were just talking a little bit about how some of the these links of imperialism and the violence that occurred in El Salvador. Many of the people behind that are, still even in positions of government in the U.S., or at least people who sort of tacitly or explicitly supported that kind of violence. So that legacy continues to today. But perhaps we could close on another legacy that continues today, which is Romero's himself. So Romero was recently canonized, as you said at the top of the show. In the book, which you had published before that, you say that the canonization is imminent as you're writing it. So just kind of thinking through, all the time that you've spent thinking about Romero and all the situations surrounding his death and his life, does his canonization change anything about how you or how we should remember both his life and the struggle for justice in the the events of his martyrdom and beyond?
It does, and his the importance of his canonization can't be overstated. He's the first saint ever from El Salvador. He is somebody who has essentially mythical status in El Salvador, and the recognition of his martyrdom and his importance by the Vatican in making him a saint, I think is of tremendous importance to El Salvador, and particularly so because it took so long and had to overcome not only politics within the Vatican, but also politics from El Salvador, where there were many people working behind the scenes to see that Romero was not made a saint, and his cause was far from guaranteed to be successful, and his beatification, which is the first step in the process of becoming a saint, was delayed for a very long time, because he was such a controversial figure. So the fact that his cause eventually overcame all of those obstacles and he was made a saint, I think gives it even greater importance. So it's a tremendous recognition at on such a global level of the importance of Oscar Romero in El Salvador, in Latin America, and worldwide. That being said, it does bring the prospect of some negative aspects. So one of the things that I talk about, I think, in concluding the book is that, as Romero was absolutely vilified by certain sectors of society. Obviously, one sector of society killed him. Others, denounced him in the most horrible terms, in newspapers and in media, such that at the time of his death, he was certainly not widely accepted in all aspects of Salvadoran society as a hero, even though he was amongst the majority of the population, which were the campesinos, the poor farmers in El Salvador, and certainly by people on the left. He was considered a hero, but that was not across the board. With his canonization, and you could see over the years as his cause for sainthood started advancing, Romero's figure in El Salvador became more centralized, and the I guess the rough edges of his legacy have been smoothed down. When you read one of the great pleasures in writing the book was going back and reading his homilies, and it is impressive how outspoken Romero was and how pointed he was in his criticism of the military, of the oligarchs, even of forces on the left. He did not pull any punches, and he was very specific with his criticisms in a way that is, I think, is now sometimes forgotten a bit, as his image is, I think, sanitized a little bit, is a word I used, to be a more acceptable and more palatable national figure. Right? His name is on the international airport, so somebody who seems to have that much appeal across the country, well, for people in certain political sectors, if you're going to recognize someone like that as a national figure, where certainly you can't talk about the strong criticisms that he registered back when he was alive. And so that is a concern with his canonization, is that even as his legacy, I guess, grows, and as he's better known and becomes such an important historical figure, that tends to have the impact of maybe smoothing out those sharp edges, I should say, rather than rough edges. And you don't want to see that happen. I tried to use some of his homilies to make the point that there is a reason that he was so hated by some people in El Salvador, and that's because he denounced them very clearly for what he saw as wrongful conduct, and so I hope that he can be remembered for being a true voice of justice, and not just in some sort of generic sense, but in looking at the very specific ways in which he was seeking to end the repression in El Salvador and improve the lives of the Salvadoran people. And I hope that in the long run that is what his legacy will be.
Thanks so much for that. I hope that as well. Certainly, it would be great to allow more people to come into contact with the specificity of somebody like Romero. I guess we should probably drive everyone back to your book here at the end of the hour. It is an amazing text, The Assassination of a Saint. There's lots and lots and lots more detail provided there. And there's also a companion website that we were looking at too that has plenty of kind of supplemental material. But we just wanted to say thanks so much for spending this time with us and laying this out, and thanks for the work that you're doing. I mean, it's crazy that it's so difficult to get even some kind of modicum of justice in a situation like this. And as your book shows, you and your team seem to have taken it very, very seriously. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you were interested in the book and in our work, and I really appreciate you having me on and highlighting Romero and his legacy. So thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can find us on Twitter. We are at the Magnificast. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. You can send us an email at themagnificast@gmail.com. The music, as always, is by Amori Armstrong and the Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was glowing in the lights of the downtown. Saw a spark in your eyes, I just spoke it. Said we're gonna turn this whole place upside down. Then you said, my dear,